This second part of color vision is going to go through the functions of color vision. I think he does this at the beginning of the chapter, but I ended up mixing things around a little bit for figuring out how to put these all together. And then subtractive and additive color vision. And then I'll go through just a little bit of history. So the first function of color vision that I usually go through is just the beauty that color gives us. Every once in a while, we have a really great exhibit at the Columbia Museum of Art that I can refer to. And one time I remember teaching this class, and it was Mark Rothko, who basically just uses colors in this really expressionistic fashion, similar to the Joseph Albers that we saw at the very, very beginning of discussing color perception. But I also have up here, so these are things I stole from the internet. One is a picture of the fall in New England, and the other is a Monet painting of the spring in France. And I feel very lucky that I get to teach this class, and that color vision usually comes at some point during the fall when I can see the change in colors and it makes sense to talk about them, or at some point during the spring when, again, just the blooming of the flowers and the differences in the colors that are available to us are there in the spring are really incredibly beautiful. And so it's not a bad idea, again, to pause. I'm going to keep suggesting that you pause things in the next couple of slides, like next few presentations, to really appreciate how much beauty color gives us, to look out your window. Like, I live in the woods, and everywhere I look, there are different shades of green and brown, but it's the complexity of the greens and browns that are really beautiful when you're off in the pine tree woods of the Carolinas. Another function of color vision is that it signals identification and classification. So it helps us to identify objects and classify objects. This is true for both man-made objects and objects from nature. And so these pictures are from stimuli from Tanaka and Presnell in 1999, where they presented participants with either, I'm just going to use the bananas that are their canonical kind of yellow color, maybe with a little bit of green-brown, versus bananas that were this purple color. And people just had to identify what the object was, and they were faster to identify the bananas when they were of their canonical kind of yellow color. And that makes sense when we think through it, that the color of an object helps us to identify that object. Color also helps us to identify food sources in comparison to what's around those food sources. So this is helpful for our survival. This is actually what is commented on maybe very quickly in the article about the genes of color vision, where he talks about, I'm pretty sure it's in that article, he talks about how New World monkeys, monkeys used to have dichromatic color vision, and New World monkeys had this mutation, and they kept this third cone around because it helped them to distinguish their food specifically. And so how exactly that mutation occurred and what it gave to the monkeys, it sounds like it depended on their particular food source. So for a particular New World monkey that ate bamboo, the ripe, fresh bamboo was differentiated from its surroundings based on what those cones gave that monkey the ability to distinguish. Hope I got my words in the right order there. And so this picture is basically showing trichromatic color vision, somebody who might be going to pick berries. I can't tell if these are raspberries or red blackberries that aren't black yet, but if you've ever picked blackberries specifically, I've not picked raspberries very often, but blackberries have stickers and thorns around them. And if you're monochromatic, if we look over to the right-hand side there in B, a person who is monochromatic is not getting the differentiation in the color, so that they would have to feel around and prick their hands in order to find the berries by feel. And what color vision gives us is the ability to see those fruits and berries. And so that was a real leg up, an advantage for us in the evolutionary chain. This is usually another place where we take some pause and people share their experiences with color vision. And again, this is typically done a little bit earlier, and I think it's important for us to share perspectives on color vision. And I've done a little bit from my own perspective of not really seeing the distinction of colors that I think a lot of people see, not matching my clothes. I mean, I think I see the distinctions of color. I'm just not really aware of how they go together, how they match, all that well. I do really enjoy the fall and the spring, and I enjoy the differences in greens. Usually when I go into depth perception, which we're not going to get to go into this semester, I talk a little bit about motion parallax and some of the two-dimensional cues to depth perception. And I usually do this whole, you know, when I'm driving home, I am in the painting. Okay, I am in the video game. When you're driving and moving through something, the motion and the depth and all of that is the motion parallax. All of that is changing so fast, and what's closer to you is changing more quickly than what's far away. So clouds are not, or they're moving very slowly in comparison to the trees that are right next to you or the guardrails or whatever. And if you add kind of color to that, I do this almost every day that I drive back and forth from school, of this kind of just appreciation and awe that I am in the painting. It is happening, or the video game. It is happening around me in real life, in real 3 dimensions, in real motion, and my brain is doing all that calculation and all those different neurons are firing in different patterns very quickly in order for me to take in all that information, and it kind of blows my mind. And so if I could get you to, even since we're not going to talk about motion and depth and all that, even just to experience and think about how awe-inspiring color is. Usually I have students share at this point, and it's helpful, I think. I've had students talk in those discussions about their experiences of warm and cold, when they talked about synesthesia and so forth. Again, I don't feel those very strongly, and but I think it's really interesting for us to share with each other and think about how other people are experiencing color, why we have different favorite colors, how much of that is classical conditioning versus how much is something different. I don't know. It's a fascinating aspect of our perceptual worlds. I am going to share Mr. I's story. It's on page 195 of the Goldstein book. He talks about a man who was an artist, and he had a car wreck. I think it was a car wreck where he got some brain damage, and he ended out with the cerebral achromatopsia. So if you read the cerebral achromatopsia article, you'll see how complicated that can be, and what region of his brain was damaged. It looks like part of V4, but I'm not going to say that for sure because I don't know if he had some prosopagnosia or other issues. But clearly, partly because he was an artist, I think, this change from his world of being a trichromat and seeing the range of colors that we see to becoming a monochromat and seeing no real difference in color, only really differences in maybe wavelength and shades of gray. He finds it depressing and disturbing for a while. He talks about not really seeing his dog very well because his dog's just another shade of gray against the trees and the grass and everything. He talks about sunsets no longer being fascinating or interesting or fun, and then maybe the color of some kind of food that he eats, that it's just not even enjoyable to eat food because of the tomato is no longer red, the orange juice is no longer orange, it's just this blah kind of brownie gray color that has no real feeling for him anymore. He does become an artist that deals solely in blacks and whites and shades of gray. He eventually gets over some of this depression that was really caused by his loss of color vision, but you can imagine how hard that must be, and especially given his background. And again, we all experience colors to a really different degree, and how much they affect us is really to a different degree. It's all really fascinating. Additional concepts that I need to distinguish are subtractive color mixing and additive color mixing. And I'm going to tell you right now that the first time I taught this material, I was teaching the introductory psychology class at Midlands Technical College, and they got angry with me, and they told me that I was calling their kindergarten teacher a liar, and that's simply not true. Kindergarten teachers and elementary school teachers are not going to talk about these scientific words, and the idea with mixing colors is that we're adding colors together. But when we're talking scientifically, what's being subtracted or added in these labels is wavelength information, or what wavelengths are being reflected. And when we are mixing together paints and crayons and things like that, we are continuing. Those colors are absorbing some wavelengths and reflecting some wavelengths. And as we're mixing them, those colors continue to absorb the wavelengths that they were already absorbing. I mix another color, it's still absorbing the wavelengths that it was absorbing. And so we're subtracting out wavelength values, wavelengths that are not being reflected now. And I'm going to do this with a picture that I think makes a lot more sense. So if we look at our different potential paints or pigments here, if we're looking at blue paint, it is going to be reflecting, right, the shorter wavelengths, maybe a little bit of the medium wavelengths. It's going to be absorbing the longer wavelengths. And if we look at yellow paint, blue and yellow are the easiest to look at. If we look at yellow paint, if you remember that, it's going across those medium and long wavelengths of what's being reflected. So it's really reflecting the long wavelengths, and it's also reflecting the medium wavelengths. It's absorbing those shorter wavelengths and not reflecting those. And so if we mix those together, my blue paint continues to absorb the long wavelengths. My yellow paint continues to absorb the short wavelengths, and we're subtracting out those wavelengths from being reflected. And so the only thing being reflected now are the medium wavelengths that both of those paints were reflecting before. So the only thing being reflected is what's common. Everything else that was being absorbed is subtracted out from what's being reflected. When we talk about additive color mixing, again, we're talking about the wavelengths that are being reflected. And so the easiest way to look at it is with theater lights. I'm going to look at a picture in a second that hopefully helps. But if we overlay theater lights, then everything that I'm reflecting with one light, I overlap that some with another light, that everything that it's reflecting, we both continue to reflect everything we were reflecting before. So we're adding together the wavelengths that are reflected. And in additive color mixing, complementary colors mix to an achromatic color. And I'm going to use blue and yellow again, as those are complementary colors. And I've also had students complain about the word complementary. Again, this is not about what the words that we would use in art. These are the words that we're going to use in science. And when we're saying they're complementary, we're going to continue to talk about these colors and what that means. But blue and yellow are complementary colors. And so if I take a yellow light with everything it's reflecting and I overlay it with a blue light and everything it's reflecting, I'm going to see a white light as we get to the achromatic color. Again, this is theater lights, and that's actually occurring out in the world. But if we look at something like the way old TVs work and the way they have these little dots, that if you look really close at the TV at a particular point in the TV, it's going to look like little dots. Pointillism, that kind of art, uses the same kind of additive color mixing, where the mix is in the mind. The mix is happening as it's going through neural processing, really. And tapestries do this same kind of thing. And I'm going to show first an example to discuss this with theater lights, and then I'm going to show some examples from pointillism, because that's the best easiest thing to talk about from slides. So if I look at my theater lights and what they are reflecting, and we're going to go back to the blue and yellow, which we just saw with the paints, and I might say that the blue is reflecting short wavelengths. I might say short and a little bit of medium, but whichever. It doesn't really matter where exactly that is. But my blue is down at the short wavelengths end of the spectrum. My yellow light is reflecting medium and long wavelengths, and so when I overlay those, I add to the wavelengths that are being reflected from both of those. So now short, medium, and long wavelengths are being reflected, and that's again going that across the electromagnetic spectrum in these complementary colors, and now I get to an achromatic color, which is white light. When we look at pointillism, the mix is in the mind. I took these slides, some of these pictures from Dr. Robin Morris. One of my students looked up this picture. I've never figured out the artist, and when he looked it up, it looked like it was actually a picture that was not a pointillist painting, but was manipulated with technology to create this. But so what we're seeing here, it looks like a very pale-faced Japanese woman. We're going to see how this is created with tiny dots, and that we are putting that information together to create this perceptual experience. And I never know exactly how this is going to work, but usually on the screen, it's really easy to tell, and I can see it on my laptop, and I hope that you can make this full screen and see that. So what we're seeing is a pale-faced Japanese woman in the previous picture, and you'll have to move back the video because I usually go back and forth a bit here, but she is made up of, you can see some of these really quite dark purple dots on her face, but when we move away from it, we don't see the little dots that are making up her face. It gets mixed in the mind to create a coherent perception of the lighter color, and it's really we're adding together those wavelengths that are the little dots. So another example of a pointillist painting that I had to include, because this one I know, and I know that it's gorgeous. This is a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte. It was created somewhere between 1884 and 86, and this is a painting by Georges Seurat. If you've seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you'll see this painting in a movie where they move up close to it. But if you get to go ever to the Art Institute in Chicago, this is a gorgeous painting to see, and it's really quite moving. This is huge. It would probably take up one of my entire walls, and it is created of little dots. And so what I'm showing here, you cannot tell that at all because it's so tiny. But even in the movie, they move up close to it where you can see there's a boy crying a little bit farther back on the left, behind those people with their dog that are kind of in the front, and or his mouth is open. It looks like he's crying, and they close in on that face, and it's just made up of all these little dots. And if you think about him creating this huge painting of all those little dots, it must have taken forever. And it's a beautiful, very moving kind of painting. But again, when you move off from it, you can't tell that at all. The mix is in the mind, and there are lighter colors. It appears lighter than if you're right up on top of the painting. You'll see these darker dots. And again, this is like the way television works. This is the way a lot of tapestries work. So if you get to go to a place where you can move off and away from a tapestry and then move toward it, you'll see it really changes, and its depth and appearance and its darkness as you move in towards it. I'm going to do a little history here of how we know that white light is made up of the spectral colors of those various wavelengths that are giving us the perception of different colors. This all was originally discovered and discussed by Sir Isaac Newton in about 1704. He came out with his book Optics, where he first makes that distinction between the psychological experience of light, or what we experience as color, and the physical characteristics of light, where he realized that color is not a property of the wavelength itself. It's the brain's way of informing us which wavelengths are present in our environment. And if you want a funny kind of, when you realize that your idols were really wrong about something, you can read about the color war, quote, the color war between Sir Isaac Newton and Goethe, where Goethe I respect a great deal, but he did not believe Sir Isaac Newton, and complains a lot about this whole idea that white light is made up of these various colors. And so if we look at a prism, we are taking sunlight through the prism, we are going to see that rainbow of colors, the Roy G. Biv, and they will be those sinusoidal waveforms. And how did Newton actually gain evidence of this? Well, he performed this experiment where he allowed white light to come in through, so I have this card-looking thing here with a circle through it, and so that's a circle that's been taken out, and so the white light is coming through just one little area and going into a prism, and we're seeing the rainbow. Well, he took another bunch of cards, or this gives us the a longer ruler looking, but so something where he could punch out holes, but these were little cards, and he moved those along from the red light to the yellow light to the blue and indigo violet, to those lights that those colors that you could see in the prism. And then he allowed just that light to come through after going through the first prism, and then he put that through a second prism. And what you can kind of tell there, I hope, is kind of clear in the picture, that the longer wavelength light is not being refracted or bent quite as much as the medium, the yellow, or the short, which is being bent the most. So this was showing him that these wavelengths had different physical properties. And so again, our psychological experience of color is telling us what wavelengths are out there, and those wavelengths have different physical properties. They have different wavelengths. And we have now, I have that at the bottom of the color spectrum, going from about 400, those short wavelengths, about 400 nanometers, to those longer wavelengths of about 700 nanometers. And you can see the different properties by looking at that second set of prisms. So I want you to think about potentially pausing this here and thinking through these concepts, pausing and coming back to this with your little bottles of water or something that has water where you can see the water, and your food coloring. I'm thinking about these concepts of selective reflectance versus selective transmission, as well as subtractive color mixing versus additive color mixing. And again, when we do this in class, there's always somebody who is picking up on what's going on. It's pretty complex. If you can pause it here and think about what's happening. I'm going to again pause and tell you if you can pause it here so that I'm not just giving you the answer, but to go fill your water bottles with food coloring and come back to this very end. So especially if you're using the voiced over PowerPoints, but even you can just pause this on your YouTube and go and come back later to this very end piece. I'm gonna walk through. If you have a bottle of water and you're putting in food coloring, what's happening there is really a kind of selective transmission, right? That what is the color that you're seeing is what's being transmitted through that liquid. And if you keep adding colors, it keeps getting darker and darker And often when I'm doing this in class, it gets this, there are a few students who have made some nice green, or, you know, something that something with yellow. The thing is if you make something and it gets kind of brown or not that well colored, and you start adding more color, because this is subtractive color mixing, it's going to look more and more brown or black or ooky. It's just not a nice color. And so when we look around at people's bottles of water, it's really clear that it's subtractive color mixing. Because even though we're adding these colors together, the thing is what we're subtracting out is the wavelength information. And no amount of yellow is going to change my ooky brown into something lighter, because I keep just subtracting out those wavelengths.